Welcome to the Ferment Station. That's right, we made a podcast and we talk about home brewing.
Today's topic is it a stall at all?
And this comes up a lot. We get a lot of people asking about stalls, and they're calling things stalls that aren't necessarily stalls, and they don't know what to do about a stall, and why did it stall, and trying to identify why. And there's so many things. And a lot of time people don't give enough information. And that's the first thing that we always like to ask is if you have a question, the first thing we need to know is, what did you make? Not just, I think my brew stalled. What can I do? Because that we can't help. There's no way to actually answer that question. There's a million different ways that could go.
The number one thing we tend to ask when asked these questions ourselves is, what was your gravity reading?
Yep.
And so if you are one of those people that aren't able to get the material to check your gravity reading, or one of those diehards like, I don't care about ABV, I'm not doing gravity readings. Well, gravity readings just aren't for ABV. They're to know what's going on in your brew and what process of the fermentation you're currently at. So if you don't take a gravity reading, you won't be absolutely 100% sure of whether you're even having a stall situation.
Right. It could be just totally fine, and you don't, it should be where it is, but without a reading, you just don't know. But we actually have notes here.
We do.
So let's start with this.
Let's start off with, what is a stall?
Okay, the definition of a stall is when a brew is not fermenting anymore, there are still sugars left, fermentable sugars left, and the yeast has not reached its alcohol tolerance. That is the basic definition that covers almost all categories. Now, something that's important to understand is, what is yeast alcohol tolerance? This is a guideline. Think of it like the Pirates Code. It's not an exact, but let's say you have a yeast that has a 12% alcohol tolerance according to the manufacturer. And they range anywhere from like 9-ish to I think EC 1118 is at 18. And there might even be a couple of turbo yeast that claim over 20, but take that with a grain of salt. But yeast tolerance is just literally the alcohol range at which the yeast just give up. They say, nope, I'm done. I can only swim in so much of my own poop, because that's what alcohol is to them, is poop.
So, in other words, they're intolerant of something higher than that.
Exactly. And that's the first thing that you need to know. If you know that you are only at, like, say, 10% ABV, but your yeast has a tolerance of, say, 12 or 15, then you possibly have a stall.
That's, again, where those gravity readings come into play, because if your gravity reading shows that you have a significant amount of fermentable sugars left in your brew and you're under that alcohol tolerance, guess what? You have a stall.
Before we go any further, let's talk about what is not a stall.
So let's say you have a significant amount of fermentable sugars still left in your brew, but you have surpassed the alcohol tolerance. That's not a stall. Those yeast are not going to continue fermenting. They're done. It doesn't matter how much extra sugar they have. They're done.
Exactly. So that's the main difference there, is if you've reached the tolerance of your yeast, probably not a stall. If you haven't, could be a stall.
There's another example. Say you haven't reached the tolerance of your yeast, but your gravity reading shows there's no more fermentable sugars. Well,
that's not a stall.
That's not a stall. There's just nothing left for them to convert.
Which we normally work to dry and then sweeten to taste and then stabilize in some way. We always pasteurize. But we are starting to look at, there is a meadery that we heard about that surpasses the alcohol tolerance of their yeast on purpose. And they do that because the way yeast work, they actually consume different sugars at different times. So they actually get a different flavor in the end. It's an interesting idea and something I'd like to work on and maybe test with. But for the moment, we tend to still go dry and back sweeten to taste. It's very repeatable, very reliable, and very solid. Plus, it maintains a lower starting gravity in most cases. So you're not going to stress the yeast simply due to too much sugars in there, because too much sugar will actually kill the yeast. And I don't mean dormant, I mean kill.
Brian's getting ahead of himself. So we have started off by identifying what a stall is and identifying what a stall is not. If you have any questions at this point, please feel free to ask in the comment section below, and we will try to answer as much as possible.
Absolutely.
So the next phase is, why did it stall?
There's a lot of reasons for a stall, and that's why someone just saying, what do I do, isn't really all that helpful, because in order to know what to do, you need to know why it stalled in the first place. And 99.9% of the time, the answer is they started with too much sugar. We hear this all the time. And it even happens when they say that they are making our recipe. And I don't mean to trash anybody, but it's a common thing to do this. We shoot for a 1.100 gravity, let's say, in one of our recipes. Somebody says they're copying our recipe exactly, but they wanted more alcohol, so they start at 1.160.
That's not how this works.
You can try it, but it's more than likely going to kill the yeast and stall before it even reaches the alcohol tolerance. Now, on the rare occasions that it actually does get to the alcohol tolerance of the yeast, it's still not a stall, like we said before. It's actually done. It did what it's supposed to do. But let's just say, for instance, you had too much sugar and it stalled far below the tolerance of your yeast. That means yeast death. Your yeast are dead. Adding nutrients at that point is not going to help. There's nothing you can really do except, well, we'll get to that in a little bit. First, we want to talk about all the ways to identify the stall, and then we'll get to how to fix them.
So another reason why a brew might stall is because it's simply too cold.
That's probably the second biggest reason why they stall. We always hear from usually around late November until early March, the number one question is, my brew seems to have stopped bubbling. What happened? And 9 times out of 10, they live in a colder climate and it's just colder. Even 5 or 8 degrees difference can actually mean a lot. In our instance, we tend to keep our house between 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I could even probably say right now it's a little bit different, 69 to 74 lately. It just seems to be. So we're within 5 degrees, but I see this in our brews. It'll be bubbling away, and then we go to bed, get up the next morning when I make it cooler overnight, and it's bubbling slower. But then it'll speed up through the day. So that even that 5 degree difference is making a huge difference. And if you drop too far below what the yeast like, they go dormant. That doesn't mean they're dead. They go dormant. It's very hard to kill yeast. You can freeze them to death, but it takes a long time and it has to be very, very, very cold.
It's much easier to kill yeast with heat than it is with cold.
Absolutely. So as far as temperature goes, though, each yeast does have a working temperature that the manufacturer gives. Best to stay roughly the middle of that temperature range, because as you go higher, you can produce off flavors, which sometimes could be favorable for esters, but most times you want to try to avoid that. If you go towards the low end of it, you could risk a stall at that point.
A note, again, on temperature. If you know you're going to be brewing at a colder temperature, there are plenty of yeasts that thrive in this environment. So do a little research and find a yeast that's going to work in your temperature range, and that way you can avoid a stall.
Perfect example of this is 71B and D47, both by Lalvin. Perfect example of a higher temperature yeast and a lower temperature yeast that both work really, really well in those environments. We found 71B works great for us. We tried D47 for a long time and it just kept stalling out. It really didn't like our warmer temperatures. Whereas I hear from others, and we have a lot of feedback from, tons of people who use our brews and give us feedback that said 71B didn't work for them, but D47 does. And when I started asking, what kind of a climate do you live in? They always lived in a colder climate than us. They were looking at 60 to 65 degrees versus our 70 to 75 degrees. And D47 was the winner. 71B never really worked well for them. So really awesome to see that in actual practice. And I'm sure there are plenty of other examples. We just haven't encountered them yet, or I haven't enough data to put that together.
I think a key thing to keep in mind with fermentation of any type is that this is a biological process.
Yep.
You are dealing with living creatures that are doing what comes naturally to them. So if their environment is inhospitable to them, then they're not going to be able to do their job as well.
The other thing to keep in mind, and I say this as a joke, but I mean it, is yeast can't read. They don't know what that package says. They don't know what they're supposed to do. They can only do what their biology allows them to do. So it's kind of like, I'm gonna refer to Pirates of the Caribbean. A yeast has to decide what it can do and what it can't do. And some of them like warm, some of them like colder. It's just that simple.
So that brings us up to another reason why something could stall, and that's if there are inhibitors in your fermentation. That could be something as like a preservative
Yep.
that's often found in juices, even on some dried fruits.
Ites and eights.
Yep, you want to avoid those because being a preservative, they're
That's what it's made to
actually
do.
halting the fermentation process.
Yep. That is exactly what preservatives are for. Some spices also, they have antibiotic properties, and that can hamper fermentation. We've not seen that as much. I tend to like, I'm lazy, okay, I'll be honest. I like to put my spices in at the beginning, and we've not really had much issue with that. Some people have said that they did, and I think all things being equal, it won't make much difference. But maybe if you're a little on the cooler side for your yeast, and then you do this, maybe that those two factors together could cause it. But again, it's down to you have to identify what the real problem is. A fourth thing that we're having less, I'm less suspicious of it as a cause of stalls is acidity or pH. We're not as fond of using that as a line in the sand so much as just a general guide. If you see that everything is perfect, but your pH is 2.0, yeah, it's probably your pH is the problem. But the fine line of pH is we did a couple of tests, and one of them, we didn't adjust pH at all. It was way more acidic than we thought it should be, and it fermented just fine. It worked perfectly.
There is a thing, an addendum, if I may, to the pH situation, and that is dependent on what you're actually brewing.
Yeah.
The test that Brian's referring to was a wine, a grape juice wine that we were fermenting.
Right.
And the pH didn't seem to be an issue for that to be successfully fermented. Where if you go something like a sugar wash, a neutral spirit type base,
It could.
there's really not much going on there. So any stressor to the yeast could be exaggerated potentially, and so pH may be a greater issue.
Which kind of goes along with what I was saying. If you're in an already cold temperature and you add an antibiotic type spice, you're compounding variables that cause a stall. So in that case, if you don't have some extra nutrient, like she said, in like just a sugar wash or even a mead possibly, and you have it too acidic, then it could potentially cause a stall. And I know we're saying a lot of possible and maybes and could be's and that kind of thing, because there's almost never going to be this is 100% this is the reason it stalled. It's usually going to be a combination of factors.
There are so many variables with home brewing that to say a definitive answer is 100% applicable all the time would be an outright lie.
Normally, it's sort of like an investigation. You look at it and you say, okay, well, I might be a little bit too high on the sugar, and maybe it's a little cooler, and the pH is a little bit low, and I added cinnamon and allspice berries. Okay, well, you just added 4 things that can potentially cause a stall. So you want to work through those and figure out which might be the worst culprit and go from there, which leads us to the next chapter. How do you fix a stall?
Now, we're going to start with what caused the stall initially. So our first cause was too much sugar.
Yep. If you have too much sugar in your brew and that's what caused your stall, like for instance, you start at a 1.160, or let's just say your hydrometer popped out of the test tube when you put it in. I've actually had people describe it that way to me, which means it's off the chart. It's way past 1.160. No yeast is actually going to effectively ferment that without extensive extras, nutrition schedules, and like you really have to know what you're doing if you're going to try to do that. But if you have that and it's stalled at say 1.080, I got news for you. There's a couple things against you here. First, if you just add new yeast to that, you're probably going to kill that yeast too, because there's already alcohol there. You've already fermented 80 points of alcohol or of sugars into alcohol, which is something in the range of 10 or 11% alcohol already. So you drop new yeast in there, they're going to be shocked. They're probably going to die or just instantly go dormant, and it's not going to work. And that usually is what everybody's first instinct is, just add more yeast. Not necessarily the right thing to do here, because you've already got a situation that they can't ferment. Adding more yeast, you're just going to give it a situation that it can't ferment, and it's yeast that's not even used to that alcohol. So it's actually worse. But what you can do is dilute it. And when I say dilute, I mean you have a 1.080 gravity right now, and you have about 10 or 11% alcohol. but you started at 1.160 or higher. So why not just cut it in half? Literally just split it into 2 containers, fill the rest of the way with water. By the way, don't put juice because juice has sugars in it. Use water and fill them up. Now, instead of a 1-gallon batch, you have a 2-gallon batch with an effective starting gravity of 1.080, but your gravities currently are 1.040. Now you add new yeast. Now it should ferment out to dry. That's the first way to fix it.
Sure. And the reason why you're adding new yeast is because more than likely the excess sugar from the initial fermentation ruptured the cells in the yeast, so they are dead. They exploded,
Yeah, there's a scientific term for that.
Yep.
But what happens is it's osmotic pressure. What happens is they want to seek equilibrium. So the excess sugars in the liquid will permeate through the cell walls, and they will want to equalize the amount of sugars in the cells versus what's in the must. But that's going to be too much for those cells, and they literally rupture, and the yeast are dead. So it's a stall, but it's yeast death.
So our next reason for a stall is it's too cold.
If it's too cold, warm it up. There's a lot of ways to do this. It could be as simple as just wrap a blanket around it.
Yeah.
That's the simplest way. A blanket or a towel. We've seen people do that.
I've seen some people repurpose like little dog sweaters because they fit on the 1-gallon jugs perfectly. And you can get those pretty cheap, particularly after a holiday season. They put the holiday themed products on sale in the clearance rack. So you can grab up some silly little critter outfits and put them on your carboys.
That is one way to do it. Another way is an aquarium heater. Now, for this, you want to just lay it on it, but you want to make sure that the temperature doesn't go too high, because if you go past the expected operating temperature, you're probably going to kill your yeast the other way. You're going to end up pasteurizing it. But also be careful, because some of those heaters might pass too much heat into the bottom of the glass fermenter or a plastic fermenter and melt them or shatter them.
Yeah, you want to make sure that whatever heating mat you have is something that you can control and that you won't have to physically put something inside your brew.
We'll look these up, and maybe we can link one or two that you would recommend.
Sure. Seed starting mats are really good because they typically have a device that controls their temperature. Also, heating mats for reptiles works really well because they typically go underneath the aquarium, and so they're used to not transferring thermal shock to the glass aquarium.
Oh, wow, that's really good. See, always ask someone who's had lizards and or is a gardener.
That would be me in both accounts.
Yep. So those 2 ways are a great way to warm it up. Another way that I've seen people do, I don't know if I really like this way. It just seems like it's harder to maintain. They use hot water in a bigger bucket and dip the fermenter in. Now, if you happen to have an immersion circulator that can go low enough, and I mean like 70, 75 degrees, then that way could work. It's just now you have an electric device running 24/7 to keep the temperature up. I'm not sure how much I love that idea, but I suppose it could work, and it would actually be a very precise way to measure that temperature, but it could work. Another way that some people have done is the hot water idea, like using hot water bottles or hot water in a bucket, and then they wrap the fermenter. That works as well, too. Another reason why it could stall, and we didn't even get into this, is if it's too hot. We get this every once in a while. Somebody will say that they're in the tropics or they live in a desert region, and it just gets up over 100 degrees all the time, and they don't have air conditioning or whatever, and their brews are stalling. What's actually happening is they're pasteurizing themselves because they're getting close to that temperature. Yeast start to die at around 110 degrees Fahrenheit, but as I said, yeast can't read, and they're biological. So if it's close to that and they are just like, oh, this is just too much for me, they're going to die. It's not like at 109.9 they're alive and kicking, and 110 they die. It's not really like that. They will. There's a range.
So something to keep in mind, if you're brewing in a location that you are not living in. So like if you're in the north and you keep your brews in the basement or in the shed or in the snow, I've heard that. Or if you live where it's really hot and you keep them outside in full sunlight, both of those situations are not good for fermentations. And if you have space in your living space, then bring them inside. Keep them in the shade. Keep them in a more constant temperature. Whatever you can do to give them a better environment is really going to help you with the fermentation process.
If you have no choice but to keep your fermenters in a too hot environment, which could even mean 80 or 90 degrees, depending on the yeast you're using and what you're looking for, an easy way to keep them cool, it's easy to do, but you have to maintain it, is to take a wet towel and wrap it around it. Evaporation will actually cool them off and keep them significantly cooler. Another way is make basically a keezer, like a refrigerator that you can control the temperature of and keep that temperature lower, not as low as a normal refrigerator. Please don't do that. Then you have the opposite problem. And that way you can keep the temperature maintained to be perfect for your yeast. I know these are not the simplest methods, but this is one way that you may have to deal with it. If you have 105 degree temperatures all the time, your yeast aren't going to like that. They're not going to do well. Although I don't think that I would like that much either. Yes, I know I live in Florida, but I live in air conditioning.
Hopefully these suggestions get the wheels going and you can figure out your own method of adjusting the temperature for your brews. So next up is it's too acidic.
Yep. If it was too acidic, adjust the pH. If it was way too basic, adjust the pH. And by that, I mean, I can't even give a true range because this is all theoretical. I'm gonna doubt in most cases pH is going to be the cause of a stall. But let's say it was. Everything else is perfect. You have zero issues whatsoever, but it's stalled and your pH is 2.0. Okay, add a buffer, potassium bicarbonate, potassium carbonate, calcium carbonate, and if you absolutely have to, you can use baking soda, but use it sparingly because it'll add a salty, weird flavor if you use too much.
Also, remember in buffering that it's not
it's a logarithmic scale.
Yeah, so you just want to add a little bit at a time, even if you feel like you have a long way to go, because the closer you get to the number you want, the less you need to add to reach that point.
Right. And the opposite happens when you're acidifying. And to acidify, like say you're at just way too high of a pH, which is usually not as much of a problem, you want to add an acid, and that could be acid blend, that could be tartaric acid, that could be citric acid, it could be malic acid, whatever kind of acid you want to add. It could even be lemon juice. And what'll happen is the amount that you add to go from say 7 to 6 is going to be less than the amount from 6 to 5, and on and on and on. So you want to be careful with that. We always start with just a little bit and see how much change we got and just go a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. It's easy to mess it up and go the wrong way, and now you have to re-buffer it, and please don't do that. We had to do that a couple times, and it's not fun. You're just playing with those numbers. But keeping it somewhere closer to that 4 to 5 range is probably going to help, if that's even the real issue. Because I've found a lot of times when people said the pH was their problem, it really wasn't, because when they changed it, it didn't actually change anything. And it turned out it was something else.
Now, we use paper pH strips to test our pH because we find that they're really economical. And when it comes to pH, we don't really need an exact number.
Yep.
We just need to know that we're in the right range.
Yep. Good or bad. It's a binary situation. It's either too high, too low, or just right. Well, that's not binary. That's three-way. But anyway.
The last one is the inhibitors.
Okay, when it comes to those, there is a common misconception, and we actually believed it too, that if there's ites and eights in your juice, let's say, that you can boil it and make those non-effective. Well, it's not true. I actually had to look this up. Somebody said it, and I was like, really? Because we've done it a couple times, and it seemed to work. Well, it didn't have anything to do with it. We actually overpowered those preservatives, which we got lucky, because I don't think we've ever had one fail due to ites and eights.
No.
And I think it's because, especially the one that we did was white grape juice. White grape juice usually has potassium sorbate or potassium metabisulfite in it. It's usually to keep it clear looking, to keep that color. That's usually why they put preservatives in things. But they put a very small amount in. This is what I'm finding out. Certain brands are different, and every brand is a little bit different, but they usually only put a little bit in. So you'll want to experiment with different brands and figure out some may work, some may not. And that's just something you have to learn as you go. We tend to not use a lot of white grape juice, though, as a result of that, because I just don't trust it. And I've never really had a great fermentation from white grape juice. I know other people have. We've just not had great ones.
Now, we mentioned it initially with the dilution and then add yeast, but in all of these instances, if you feel like your original yeast is dead, then after you've made the adjustments, go ahead and add a fresh yeast.
Right. As long as you're not overpowering them with too much sugar, your temperature is right, and if need be, your pH is right, and you adjusted for those ites and eights, then new yeast is probably going to help. Now, one thing that a lot of people say is they want to add nutrients to fix a stall. I'm going to disagree with that, because if you add most nutrients like Fermate K and diammonium phosphate, things like that, at that point, it's not going to help, and it could actually off flavor your brew. Fermate O, I don't know that I'd really want to use Fermate O at that point either, because of it being an actual nutrient, but it probably won't harm things.
Now, there is something you can add to help your yeast along that's not going to change the flavor, and that is dead yeast, essentially. So the dead yeast that are already in your brew are going to be consumed by your new yeast strain.
Yep.
And you can also add things such as yeast hulls, if you can find them, or you can bake up just some baker's yeast so that's dead.
Yep.
And add that.
Yeah, essentially yeast hulls and dead yeast are the same thing. So like if you took just plain old, Fleischmann's, if you don't want to brew with it, which it does make a pretty mighty fine tasting brew, by the way.
Don't let the snobs tell you otherwise.
But if you want to use it as a nutritional aid, you can take some of that, put it in just a couple tablespoons of water, microwave it for like 30 seconds. It's now dead because it went way past 120 degrees. Add that into your brew. That's going to act as enough yeast hull nutrient for the yeast that are remaining to continue on with the process. Usually, my first order of operations, if I think I don't really know why this stalled, because that's the next thing on the thing. Every once in a while, you'll get a brew that I have no idea why this stalled. Everything seems fine. There's just no good reason. And sometimes it's because, well, yeast are living things and they might just be having an off week. You just never know. I'm joking, but it does happen. So the first order of operation is usually give it a really good swirl. Honestly, just get all the lees and everything that's in the bottom, get it all stirred up into solution. Sometimes degassing at the same time, because you are degassing when you do that, will actually kick those yeast back into operation, because in the lees is live, dormant, and dead yeast. Okay, so as we just said, that means yeast hulls. You have some live yeast and some dormant yeast. Those dormant yeast might be dormant just because they thought they were done. They got buried. I don't really know. I'm not a yeast scientist, so I don't actually know everything that they're doing. But also in there is going to be various proteins and things that fell out of suspension during fermentation that could be used as a nutrient for those yeast. So giving it a good stir up usually helps a lot. And getting rid of that excess gas, which is their other waste product, can also very often help with a stall.
Yes, getting rid of that gas, as Brian said, is going to essentially clean up your brew and make it a more pleasant environment for the yeast, so they might get back to work.
Right. And along with that, I usually like to add some yeast hulls. You can never go wrong adding, say, a teaspoon of yeast hulls into a 1 gallon batch. It's just never really going to hurt things at that point. So it's kind of best to do it. Or, like we said, use some boiled yeast. Do the stir up, get it degassed, add that in. 90% of the time, those unknown stalls are going to restart.
So you've given it a swirl, you've added the yeast hulls, and you've degassed, and still nothing is happening. What could you do at that last ditch moment?
Well, this is when you just pull out all the stops and you make a starter. Okay, to make a starter, it's actually a really simple process, but there's a couple steps that you want to do, and you want to do it exactly this way, because if you don't, you're going to compound the problem rather than help the problem.
To make a starter, you're going to take roughly half a cup of your must. That is your fermentation, your brew that you're starting, right? And then you're going to dilute that by half. So half a cup of must and then half a cup of water. Don't add juice because that has sugars in it. Don't add something alcoholic because that's going to raise the alcohol level. What you're intending to do is reduce the alcohol that is already present and to reduce the sugars that are already present. So you have something more neutral to add new yeast to. After you've made that half and half fermentation, after you've made that half and half solution, go ahead and add some yeast. You also want to add the right amount of Go Firm so that way they have plenty of nutrients to get started. And this is kind of giving them acclimated to the new home that you're going
Exactly.
to add them to.
Right.
So you're going to let that sit roughly 24 hours.
I've seen it done as long as 3 days.
Sure.
You want to see a good head of foam on there. You want to see fermentation before you do anything further.
Put it on the countertop out of direct light, so that way you can keep an eye on it and observe what is it doing. If everything just settles to the bottom and it's a no-go, you either have dead yeast or something's really going wacky in your fermentation. So making that starter, having less sugars and less alcohol should be enough to get an active yeast colony going. You should have a nice cloudy mixture and you should have lots of bubbles on top. So once you see that, then you can add that to your fermentation and it should start back up.
Right. If at that point it still doesn't start up, well, ask us. We'll see what we can do to help. 9 times out of 10, though, it's going to be one of the factors that we talked about some point in this video, because those are generally all the reasons why it just wouldn't start up. Now, the first thing that we didn't even mention, the easiest one that we didn't even talk about, is your fermentation never kicks off at all. It doesn't even start. Guess what that is? You got dead yeast.
Yep.
Just find a new packet of yeast from a different lot or a different style of yeast even, and try adding that.
And this is why we've gone back to the pre-hydrating our yeast before adding it to our must, because that way it gives us a sense of whether we have a viable colony or not. Seeing those little bubbles in that cloudy liquid means we're pretty much A-okay to go and can start fermentation.
So that brings us to the end of this podcast. If you have any questions about stalls, how they start, how to identify it, or if you have a stall and you want help, please ask in the comments below. We'll be happy to help as much as we can. And as always, guys, thanks so much for listening and have a great day.
Bye-bye.